Bom dia a todos, todas, todos. Então, eu vou começar apresentando a doutora Tahani Mustafa, em inglês, como é de hábito. For those who don't speak Portuguese, good morning, nice to have you back. Dr. Tahani Mustafa is the Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group, the ICG, where she works on issues including security, social, political, and legal governance in the West Bank. She holds a PhD in politics and international studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, from the University of London. She's based in the UK, Jordan, and Palestine, or best, between the UK, Jordan, and Palestine. So great to have you here, Tahani. It's a pleasure to listen to your class today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. So I think the timing of this lecture and also the title of this lecture is quite apt, considering a lot of the recent trends we've seen, especially in the occupied territories, that manifested themselves over the last year and a half. And it's difficult in this case to argue with someone who says that the current moment is hopeless. That's not to start off necessarily with a negative note, but it's just a more realistic outlook on current developments. So for the last year and a half, we've seen action from a broad-based popular resistance movement that's manifesting itself in various ways against the backdrop of the worst crisis of legitimacy and leadership the Palestinian national movement has experienced in its respective history. We're also seeing a crisis within the Palestinian National Authority, which is the governing body of Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian National Authority has lost almost all of the support from its grassroots and is increasingly ineffective as an institution. What it has become is a mechanism for doling out rewards to friends and allies in return for political support for the personalities in the leadership rather than their actual policies. The current succession crisis is another issue now facing the Palestinian National Authority. It's been led by one man who is now at the age of 87 and who looks as though at some point he will end up passing from the scene. But unfortunately, this one particular man who has ruled the occupied territories for the last 15 years has dismantled every possible legitimate institutional avenue to guarantee a smooth process for succession. There is currently no Palestinian legislative body. There is no independent judiciary. There is only an executive that is being led by the president and two individuals around him, two of his closest advisors. And that has not only undermined the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership, but it's also demonstrated the distance between the aspirations for self-governance and the bitter reality, effectively destroying not only the Palestinian national leadership, but also the credibility of their leadership that has collapsed, leading to a huge gulf that's grown between that leadership and its grassroots. And that's what we've seen now lead to the rise of the recent phenomena in broad-based popular resistance, especially armed resistance. Palestinians are now looking to transcend the divisions between factions that have hobbled efforts to mount an effective response to their current situation. At the moment, the occupied territories are undergoing the worst economic and political crisis in its history. There's been a collapse in living standards, not to mention the increasing brutal reality of a military occupation that has only grown more intrusive and more aggressive with the new right-wing Israeli government that was sworn into power back in January. And so, as I said, consequently, armed resistance has arisen quite spontaneously. We saw moments of that phenomena kind of erupt during 2015 and onwards, but it's become so much more organized now, especially in 2023. And it's begun to organize in the nationalist populist space that's being vacated by the Palestinian Authority for the reasons just mentioned. The PA has become increasingly incapable of fulfilling its role as a service provider, and more importantly, being able to manage the security chaos, as a lot of Israelis and international Western observers are calling it now. And it's precisely not just the economic and political crisis we're seeing from the Palestinian Authority, but also, as I mentioned, a lot of the Israeli policies of control over the territories that have become far more violent, especially over the last year. and that has effectively, as the saying goes, violence begets violence, and that has really accelerated this phenomenon of discontent, not only in terms of the bleakness of life for Palestinians, but also in terms of their response and pushback that we're now seeing, which is becoming increasingly violent. And you're seeing local communities really facing the blowback for that. Places like Nablus, places like Jenin. In places like Nablus, which used to be a commercial hub, we're seeing a huge economic crisis, or a further economic crisis hit the city, because Palestinians from 48, which was a huge, source of revenue, no longer want to come in and purchase and consume. We're also seeing the lack of foreign nationals enter the city itself. So it's really just accelerating a lot of the crises that were already pretty much pre-existing. And at the same time, just fueling even more discontent on the ground. And the worst part of this is that you now have a leadership that's too busy infighting over succession to actually focus on trying to improve the situation on the ground. And if anything, in many cases, a lot of these elites that are in the forerunning for succession are simply fueling that fragmentation and division on the ground to prop up their own supporters and positionality, to put themselves at the forefront. But I think what this moment also shows us is that as much as groups, these armed resistance groups, especially groups like the Lion's Den, the Jenin Brigades, groups that are now starting to proliferate across the occupied territories, where it was once limited to the north, is now moving into places like Hebron in the south, Jericho, Tubas, Tulkarm. And again, these are happening in areas, or they're proliferating in areas which are ultimately expected. I mean, we're largely seeing this proliferation in places like refugee camps, again, where living standards are low, where the PA is marginalized, where discontent is rife, where you're constantly faced with the daily realities of an incredibly brutal occupation. But I think ultimately what this also shows us is that as much as they've gained momentum, they're still very limited in their capacity and numbers. Their impact is still very much limited to the kind of rhetorical support that they're getting, the symbolic support. But in terms of the numbers that they're able to draw, it's still quite limited. At the same time, this also is very emblematic of the problem of Palestinian opposition and civil society, in that the core challenge here for the rising resistance across Palestinian communities is its lack of an overarching unifying narrative. For a lot of Palestinians, reverting back to that process of armed resistance still brings back a lot of the traumas of the consequences of what that can then entail. And a lot of that comes back from the traumas of the Second Intifada, where we saw armed resistance that led to a complete breakdown of social order, not only in terms of Israel's own military response, which was incredibly heavy-handed, but also the blowback that happened within their own communities, when there was no longer a Palestinian authority functioning. There were no longer security forces on the ground. And a lot of these vigilante groups that propped up started to rape and pillage their own communities. There was a lot of protection racketeering. And a lot of that trauma hasn't still resonated and manifested itself till today, which is why I say that as much as these groups are gaining, momentum in the popular consciousness, they're very limited in terms of the numbers that they're drawing in. And again, that goes back to the lack of any consistent unifying discourse amongst Palestinian civil society, which is so deeply fragmented, so weak. It has no common discourse. There's nothing resembling that. There is a common consciousness, but it's not coordinated. And the current state of Palestinian political society and opposition, again, is lacking, severely lacking in any tangible vision. It can really offer no alternative to the status quo, including these groups themselves. Beyond calling for resistance to an occupation, they are not able to offer an alternative to an organization like the PA, which is really at the brunt of a lot of Palestinians' discontent at the moment. The PA is very much the root of why we've seen the national movement, the plurality that used to characterize Palestinian society. That is the root for its fragmentation. And I think that again goes back to trying to understand the rise of institutional governance and how it was created in the occupied territories. And that goes back to the Oslo process. Trying to understand how we've reached the predicament we're at today requires an understanding of a lot of those institutional arrangements that were created back in the mid 90s, and that have now manifested themselves into the situation where, like I said earlier, Palestinians will describe as completely hopeless at this point in time. So to give you a brief overview of some of that institutional history, what its rationale was, what its significance was, what the implications were on the ground, it's worth considering that the very agreement, let's say, that birthed these institutions was the product of an immediate political problem that required an immediate political solution. And at the time, it was the First Intifada. It was a time where we saw mass mobilization against, again, a violent Israeli occupation. And it was something that had caught not only the Israelis off guard, but the Palestinian leadership. There were also, each side had its own rationale for wanting to even partake and enter into this agreement. For the Israelis, it was about trying to manage, the chaos that had ensued with the Intifada, the pushback that it was getting from Palestinian society. And then for the Palestinian leadership, they had their own political reasoning behind this, which, at the time, the PLO was being increasingly marginalized within regional developments. It was losing its logistical base, its political bases in places like Lebanon. It had made some, risky political decisions, costing it a lot of regional support, such as supporting Saddam Hussein in the First Gulf War. So there were a lot of incentivizations on both sides to enter an agreement that ultimately neither effectively wanted. And ultimately what Oslo was, as much as it likes to be presented, or as much as commentators like to present it as a watershed moment, it really wasn't anything of the sort. If anything, it was a continuation of previous peace agreements that had been ongoing since the 1970s. What it ended up doing was actually materializing a lot of the Israeli vision for what it had essentially thought of in terms of Palestinian self-determination, which in the Israeli peace narrative is not self-determination. For Israel, for the Palestinians, they think of self-determination in terms of autonomy, having Palestinians manage their own affairs. But to a limited extent. It's more like a devolution of certain responsibilities, but never relinquishing control over the land itself, but rather managing a population it really didn't want any significant dealing with. For the Palestinians, on the other hand, for them, they understand this to be self-determination in the purest sense, right? To lead to a state, to lead to some level of sovereignty, to give them their rights, their basic rights. Unfortunately, those two narratives have always spoken at each other rather than with each other. And in the case of Oslo, in the case of most peace agreements, it's always the stronger party that holds the most sway when it comes to what ends up materializing on the ground. And that was essentially the case in this instance. Oslo effectively cemented a lot of the power imbalances between the Israelis and Palestinians. This was meant to be an interim agreement. It was not a peace agreement. It was one that was meant to provide Palestinians with the opportunity to prove that they were worthy of something resembling a state. They were given control over the provision of basic services like health, education, sanitization, security in some places, I think probably about 18%, what constituted 18% of the West Bank. That was considered to be Area A under full Palestinian Authority control. Then you had areas B, which again, where the Palestinians would provide basic services like education, health, sanitization, but security would be relegated to the Israeli Authority. And then area C, which constitutes 60% of the West Bank. And that is under full Israeli control. And that situation has not changed. That circumstance has not changed. That distribution of territory has never changed since. But what it did do was effectively, again, cement that power imbalance. So as much as the Palestinian Authority was in charge of affairs in Area A, Israel still relegated itself the right to what it called hot pursuit, which meant that at any time it can come in, conduct incursions, conduct targeted assassinations, if it feels like at any point its security is under threat. And that was something else that I think has been very much underplayed, especially when we talk about state building. and quasi-state institution building in the Palestinian context, was the significance of a security narrative that surrounded the entire process. For the Israelis, it was about guaranteeing their own security. And who could do that better than the Palestinians themselves? Who could police the Palestinians better than the Palestinians themselves? That was the rationale at the time. For the Palestinians, again, they were in a desperate situation. So this offered, a kind of a leeway out for the Palestinian leadership in some ways. Now, the state building process itself, as almost problematic as it was from the start in terms of its rationale, the significance of Oslo, or one of its most odious legacies, is the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which was charged with doing precisely all of these tasks, right? Providing basic service provision while also guaranteeing security for Israel. Now, as much as the Israelis like to present the narrative that, the Palestinian security forces have the mandate to guarantee Palestinian security on some level, it was there are certain institutions that were very clearly mandated in those accords, such as the Preventative Security Force, which is a substantial security, politically speaking, a substantial security branch of the Palestinian security forces. That branch, its mandate is inherently political. Its mandate is to specifically ensure that there is no challenge to the status quo. The same with the general intelligence services and the military intelligence. You have the civil police who are in charge of ensuring that mundane crime, is managed and controlled within Palestinian communities. But again, Palestinian communities are very tight-knit communities. It's not really something that requires state enforced law and order. A lot of these issues tend to get very much dealt with within the confines of the community and a very kind of at a very community level. So this entire kind of state building farce wasn't lost on Palestinians at all. What Oslo ended up also doing, which was even more detrimental if we're talking about the kind of political pluralism and entrenched authoritarianism that then followed, and really the shrinking space for civil society, and the lack of accountability on pretty much any stakeholder involved in this conflict, was not only the creation of the Palestinian Authority, but more importantly, by creating this body, it shifted the center of gravity of Palestinian politics geographically and politically into the occupied territories. So now, where previously we had the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that was specifically a national liberation organization dedicated to the liberation and advocating for Palestinian political rights, you now had it morph into what should have been two separate bodies have effectively become one over time, because the leadership has pretty much remained one for both institutions. The same people that lead the Palestinian Liberation Organization up until today are the very same people that also head the Palestinian Authority, which has meant over time the two institutions have effectively merged into one almost. Now, the problem with that is not only has it meant that, again, the geographical center of gravity has shifted to the occupied territories, but it has also meant that a lot of the decision-making when it comes to broader Palestinian national politics is also very much limited to the occupied territories, unfortunately, which has excluded a vast segments of the Palestinian population, especially those living within the diaspora and refugee camps. And so now today, when we talk about elections, whether we're talking about elections to the Palestinian Authority Legislative Council or the PA presidency, or if we're talking about elections to the Palestinian National Council, the largest segment of Palestinians to determine who the leadership of the next national movement will largely be from those from the occupied territories, because those within refugee camps cannot vote. Logistically, it's not easy to provide the means to do so. And the same for those in the diaspora, especially those living within Arab states, where you cannot have, any kind of or demonstrate any political loyalty to more than one state entity. So elections are an absolute no-go in places like Jordan, or if you're talking about Palestinians in other Arab states like Lebanon, Syria, wherever. So it really has, in that sense, limited again Palestinian plurality, political plurality, right? In terms of not only discourses, but also alignments, competition, things that used to make Palestinian political society thrive. has completely been deprived of that now. Palestinian society is so deeply fragmented socially, economically, geographically, and now institutionally. If we're talking about the divisions now between the West Bank and Gaza, which again happened after the second election in Palestinian history in its almost 4 decades of existence. And again, it was the first time when we had seen an opposition party in the history of the region, not only in Palestinian politics, but also in the region itself. It was a true moment of democracy where we saw an opposition become a government. And that process didn't suit either the Israelis or the international community at the time, who had significantly tied a lot of their support and assistance, and especially state-building endeavor in Palestine, to the broader counterinsurgency operations that were happening against the backdrop of the war on terror. We're talking about the early noughties, like 2006. And this had just come off the back of 9/11 and the Iraq War and Afghanistan and the state-building projects we were seeing there. And Palestine was no exception in this instance, if any. And I think Alistair Crook, who is a British intelligence officer, actually does a pretty incredible job at mapping out how strong those ties between the UK and US counterinsurgency, broader counterinsurgency policies and campaign at the time, global campaign at the time, tied into a lot of their then projects that they were trying to implement within the Palestinian context to start propping up Palestinian state building once again after it was disrupted during the Second Intifada. He does a fantastic job, so I'd really recommend a lot of you try and go back and read his piece on that. But more importantly, what it also did was not only fragment Palestinians geographically and institutionally, but it now created a situation where Palestinian politics was being hijacked by 2 competing factions. The Fatah government, or the Fatah faction, leading the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and the de facto government of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And these 2 rival factions have, like I said, hijacked Palestinian politics ever since Hamas had won the election that suited neither Israel or the international community, that then supported a Fatah-backed coup against the elected government, driving them into and confining them within the Gaza Strip. And for a long time, those, reconciliation, or the lack of reconciliation, at this point, we can no longer talk about Palestinian reconciliation, at least not between these 2 rival factions. Palestinians have moved on to this idea of a potential confederation, but no one is deluding themselves into the idea that these 2 factions will ever be able to reconcile. And it's because Palestinian politics, with Oslo, with the advent of the Palestinian Authority, turned into this zero-sum game. The Palestinian Authority gave political elites something more tangible to fight over, which meant it gave them something, an institution, a body that gave them access to wealth and logistics in order to prop up their own power bases. And that was something that they then started to fight over, which meant that their interests became compromised. They no longer started thinking about nationalist aspirations, they no longer continued to think about nationalist aspirations or interests any longer. It was very much a self-interested elite who effectively relied on maintaining this institution and the status quo, whatever its rationale was, whatever the detriment to its own people was, at the exclusion of others. So Palestinian politics became a very, very zero-sum game. And the continued rivalry between Fatah and Hamas really is truly emblematic of that. Just how significantly divisive the institution of the Palestinian Authority has been and still is. And the worst part was that, again, this was no accident. This was something created by design. So at the time when you had these state-building processes start to come into Palestine, which, by the way, was truly one of the first cases where you had state-building from the top down. It was truly an entirely imposed process of institutional management on this population. There was absolutely no consensus even sought from those that they would soon impose this institutional process over. Absolutely none, which has also, been part of the reason why the PA has struggled for a very long time in terms of trying to garner the kind of legitimacy it needs to govern over people without having to rely on the coercive means to do so. But more importantly, and again, this is something that tends to be very much missed when we look at state-building literature, peace-building literature, and this was actually something that's very much symptomatic of state-building processes globally. But Palestine is actually a pretty great example in the sense that it lays a lot of those dynamics pretty raw, because of the way that, the political landscape is very much laid out, is that what this process tried to do, other than impose not only a new governing institution over Palestinians, while still, living under the kind of macro structure of an Israeli military occupation. Importantly, what it tried to do was to structure or restructure the limits of what Palestinians can do and think. In other words, it tried to restructure Palestinian agency. So now Palestinians were expected to no longer think of Israel as their enemy, as their occupier. They were expected to think of Israel as their partner in this wider aspiration of theirs towards statehood. As crazy as that sounds to us today, that is precisely the peace narrative that was being put out there for Palestinians and for the international community for a very long time. And that dissonance was never lost. And in fact, it's that dissonance that has become such a huge problem at the moment for the Palestinian Authority, for the Israelis, and for the international community. Because on the one hand, you are providing Palestinians with these quasi-state institutions that are really not functioning in the ways that they should. There is no basic service provision because of the rampant corruption and lack of any kind of accountability on their leadership, neither from the international community and certainly not expected from Israel. But at the same time, they're still living with the daily realities and manifestations of an occupation. So if you don't live in Ramallah and you live in places like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarm and Hebron and wherever, you are still faced every day with the reality of an armed Israeli soldier, a checkpoint, barriers, limitations to your freedom of movement. So that dissonance between what they were being told and what was actually transpiring on the ground was absolutely not lost on them. But that process of trying to restructure Palestinian agency, which became so detrimental to effectively destroying Palestinian civil society and the kind of plurality that had really characterized it for such a long time, was, there were a number of different trajectories in which the international community had facilitated that process, that this international sponsored process of state building had facilitated that process. And they had done it through things like donor funding conditionalities. So for example, if you're a civil society organization and you needed international funding for certain projects, the vetting processes for that was incredibly extensive, incredibly intrusive. Everything down to the kind of personal histories of staff, of every single member of staff in your organization, to their political affiliation, to having no history of political activity. So that really then affects who can and can't receive that funding, which then affects how you conduct yourself, right? And the same thing with the Palestinian security apparatus. During the first decade of Oslo, and this was again a fault from which the Israelis had recognized, where civil society was being hit the hardest, the Palestinian bureaucratic apparatus, their international influence was very limited. So where, international donor funding was coming into Palestinian civil society, and where you had an influx of, Palestinian international foreign international NGOs that were kind of starting to hijack that space and competing with local Palestinian NGOs, and really then limiting just how much work that these local NGOs could do on the ground, the kind of work they were doing on the ground. It started to turn into trying to create projects that would vet the most funding. So whatever was kind of, sexy at the time or in vogue at the time with the international community. So not only did that impact civil society level, but on a more bureaucratic level. At that time, international involvement was very limited. And again, that was because Israel, not because there was any negligence or because the international community were, trying to create any kind of independent capacity building. It was because Israel didn't trust a single state within the international community to really conduct that process for them. And that played on Israeli paranoia. The worry was, if you were to provide Palestinians with the logistical capability, especially a strong security apparatus, as much as Israel needed a strong coercive Palestinian Authority to clamp down on any spoilers to this process, the worry was also that what if you have an armed, militarized neighbor within its own borders? So they very much limited any international involvement. So it was almost like the Palestinian leadership were kind of left at their own discretion to figure this process out, a process that they have no previous experience with. And there were a lot of mistakes made during that early decade. Probably the best experience they had with local policing was through vigilante groups that they had previously, but they had no actual understanding of how a state needed to operate. And what ended up irking the international community even more was that at the time you had a leadership under Yasser Arafat, and Arafat was, someone who played both sides effectively. He knew how to leverage armed resistance in a way that he could use it as a kind of stick, right? So he would play the peace discourse as a carrot and then leverage these armed groups as the kind of stick that he would use against the international community, against Israel. And for that reason, he was deeply unpopular, and also at the time, he tried using the Palestinian security apparatus, an apparatus whose mandate under Oslo was to guarantee Israeli security first and foremost. He would use it as a means of, again, trying to leverage his position, concessions over Israel. So, for example, there were times where he refused to make arrests where the Israelis wanted certain suspects. He refused to hand over certain prisoners. He, was not completely open when it came to intelligence sharing. And that made him, again, deeply unpopular. Now, at some point, again, that dissonance started to unfold during the first decade, where Palestinians were not closer to anything of a state. The Oslo process was meant to be an interim agreement lasting for 5 years. They never reached the state that they thought that they would. Final status negotiations never really came to fruition. What Israel was willing to offer was nowhere near close to Palestinian aspirations or even fair by any measure. And more importantly, again, being faced with the realities of an occupation. During that first decade, settlement expansions had accelerated at the fastest pace they ever had in their history in the West Bank. And so that's how we ended up seeing that frustration amongst Palestinians being vented out through armed resistance, which then precipitated itself into the Second Intifada. And again, at that time, because of the kind of leadership you had under Arafat, you saw the PA become a facilitator to that mass mobilization, not something that stood in its way or hindered it, which is what you now see with the current leadership and these armed groups on the ground and different sort of forms of resistance that are propping themselves up. Now, that was significant because after the Second Intifada, again, you had a more systematic and concerted effort from the international community and Israel to clamp down on any kind of dissent in the occupied territories, to the extent where this time there was a serious concerted effort to restructure Palestinian agency and restructure. And to do that, they had to restructure Palestinian perceptions and understandings of their own reality. So these processes became so much more intrusive. These mechanisms of control became so much more aggressive, right? So as an example, so I had worked for a very long time on the process of security sector reform, and it was no accident that the state building process in the occupied territories became so synonymous with security sector reform, because the security sector, since the PA's inception, has become the largest and most resource-intensive institution in the entire process, in the entire PA bureaucratic machinery. So at the time, after the Second Intifada, there was a concerted effort from the US, from European countries, and actually regional countries as well, like Jordan, Turkey, as well as, with the kind of overlooking Israeli the Israeli authorities overlooking the entire process effectively to make sure that it suited their security needs at the time. But what was happening was, in these trainings, for example, just to give you a bit of an anecdote here. So at one time, they wanted to set up an academy to try and help the security forces, small unit commanders within the security forces, act as a more coherent unit rather than the kind of fiefdoms that they were sort of running their respective security sectors at the time. You know, there was a lot of competition, there was a lot of duplication of roles and responsibilities, and you had a lot of security commanders really just competing over money and resources from different donors. So they wanted, but that was also then affecting, obviously, the way that they were doing their or implementing their roles on the ground. So to try and clamp that problem out, they set up this academy. And at the time, during some of their trainings, for example, in order to teach these unit commanders what leadership meant, they would give them, you know, simulation exercises, they'd show them films, whatever. And one of the films that they showed them was Master and Commander. Now, when I asked about why Master and Commander, it was because it was the most apolitical film they could find. Initially, the Palestinians wanted an example like it, they wanted to watch Invictus. But the American trainers at the time thought that was too close to the reality that they were dealing with on the ground, right? In terms of the broader politics that film was essentially the backdrop of the film was based on. Another example was the fact that at the time when they had to rebuild the security forces that had been destroyed during the Second Intifada by the Israeli military, they deliberately made sure that no one over the age of 40 was allowed to join. And there was an extensive vetting process that went into trying to bring in younger recruits. And that was a deliberate mechanism in order to prevent anyone who had any memory of having fought in the Lebanese war or having any memory of any kind of resistance activity towards Israel from joining those sorts of institutions. So it was really about getting fresh, new, younger recruits that had really no memory other than having lived under Oslo, essentially, but not much beyond that. And what was worse was just how naturalized that became for a lot of those within this bureaucratic machinery, right? So it was almost like they tried to internalize what their role was within their broader context. So when you spoke to these younger recruits, after a lot of the training they got, after a lot of the discourse that was fed to them, they literally understood their role as providing the skeleton of a Palestinian state. Now, for those that were recipients of these projects, those that were, the people that really, if you're talking about just regular Palestinians who faced the brutality of what these security forces were being taught, it was something else entirely. There was a huge disconnect between those that worked within the bureaucratic machinery and even those that were in the higher up and mid-level to low levels, and those that were just on the ground, marginalized and removed from those processes and their experiences with the Palestinian Authority. For them, they saw them as subcontractors. For those that worked within the authority, they saw themselves as providing the skeleton of a state. And that schism has never reconciled itself, by the way. And that's where, when we talk about a legitimacy crisis, we're talking about a legitimacy crisis at every level, where the PA sees itself as something or is in denial. It's hard to determine their psyche in this, but they see themselves as providing something, and then the experience and understanding of Palestinians on the ground is something else entirely. And again, it just goes to show how deeply fragmented Palestinian political and social spaces became. And in a lot of those trainings, by the way, and this was by the admission of some of Western, a lot of Western military commanders that were responsible for a lot of these trainings, they openly admitted that when they trained Palestinian security forces to go in, provide community policing, or to kind of crack down on any kind of dissent, they're very explicit as to the three main threats they teach Palestinian security forces to fight against. And they are either demonstrators, they can either be civil demonstrators or armed protesters. They make absolutely no distinction. Groups like Hamas, again, groups that are opposed to the Oslo, Hamas are no longer opposed to that, but groups that are perceived to be opposed to Oslo and the existing status quo, and then armed groups and gangs and thieves. Now, again, that is very, very disconcerting, especially when you see how heavy-handed and how coercive the PA has become. And the fact that these tactics, those logistics were no accident. It was not an unintended consequence. That was clearly deliberate instruction they were receiving from international donors who are tasked with overseeing this process in the interest of Israeli security, to the detriment of Palestinian political and national rights. And again, what this process ended up doing is, as I said, it not only restructured agency, but it also determined the kinds of forms of agency that were allowed and those that weren't. For those that were willing to be co-opted into the system, they were, provided the benefits of the system. But for those that were, against it or disagreed with it, they found themselves either completely marginalized or outright, in some cases, destroyed, like political factions, for example. Palestinian political factions exist in all but name at this point in time. You still have existing political parties, long-standing existing political parties, but they no longer represent any kind of political agenda. A lot of them have been very much bought into this system, co-opted into this system, and those that weren't were completely marginalized from the process, and in some cases sent into exile, especially during the early decade. And it's the same with Fatah. I mean, Fatah has splintered and is so severely divided. I think this is the worst it's ever been divided in its history, precisely because there are those that support the current status quo and there are those that want change. And those that want that change have found themselves pushed to the margins. And it's those that are on the margins that are forming these groups like the Lion's Den that have now, obviously spread across the West Bank. So it really is truly a testament to how much those or the degree to which institutional arrangements in the occupied territories at the time, their rationale was to guarantee security for Israel. But what it ended up doing, the implications of that for Palestinian society, for political pluralism, for civil society, for the ability to be able to hold Palestinian leaders to account, for democracy, for liberal governance, were detrimental, absolutely detrimental. To the point now where we are, unfortunately, in a situation where, again, Palestinian society is so deeply, deeply fragmented along class lines, geographic lines, political lines, where Palestinians don't feel like they really have anyone to ultimately advocate for them. Even Palestinian civil society today, I mean, again, you have a proliferation of organizations and movements and groups, but there is, one, no unifying narrative, and two, the majority don't necessarily really speak to all of Palestinian society because of the way that it's been so significantly divided. So, the needs of Palestinians living in cities will be different to those living within camps, to those living within the diaspora. Each have their own different aspirations, their own different understandings of what a national movement should be and should look like. And again, a lot of that hasn't been by accident. A lot of it has been by design, deeply fragmenting Palestinian political society to that degree. And that's really what, the current state of political society and opposition today has really sort of showed us. It's all of those elements that were, created during the creation of the quasi-state that gave us the Palestinian Authority has really led us up to today, which is, for a lot of Palestinians, they'll tell you, is a state of complete hopelessness. On the one hand, they recognize that, the Palestinian Authority in Oslo is not going to ever get them to where they need to be. It will never give them their right to self-determination. It will never guarantee them their national rights. But on the other hand, they cannot see any alternative to that body, unfortunately, because if we do get rid of the PA, who will then, whatever limited basic services it is able to provide now, there is no one else that can fill in that vacuum. And that is really where, that sense of hopelessness really hits Palestinians today when they talk about not only the divisions, but also the lack of an adequate national movement that can really, truly offer them an alternative to the current status quo. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then hopefully we can go to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Tahani, and we'll also welcome Rafael, who will mediate the session of Q&A. That was really a very, very interesting and informative overview and analysis of the current situation, political, institutional situation, and the problem of succession in Palestine today. So I'll leave you with Rafael and to answer the questions that are coming up. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I think my phone was muted and now it's working, right? I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'm gonna say that again. So I was saying, thank you very much for your lecture, inspiring, and I like that personally. And also because when it comes to the ground here in Palestine, like not always it matches with the image or representation that we have of Palestine outside. Narrative of unity is more common found abroad, not just around. It's very important to highlight. So I would like to thank you very much for your work. And we have one question here. It's from Jules Caesar, and afterwards, so I'm gonna think. So he asks, is there any prospect for new elections, and what do you think we can expect after?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that question.
He's asking what you think that people can expect after Abu Mazen.
Okay.
There is, you want to answer this one and then we go to the next, or?
Yeah, I can do that. So unfortunately, it seems like prospects for a new election, at least in the immediate future, seem to be very slim. The current PA leadership has shown no inclination to want to go to elections. It has tried testing the waters, I think, over the last year, and it's done pretty badly in local elections, which has given it no incentive to want to go to national elections. Worse yet, it's showing in terms of popularity and support in opinion polls has just significantly declined and continues to do so. I think for the last 4 opinion polls, Fatah and Abbas is showing has been very, very poor. So there's really no incentivization for them to go to elections. Even Crisis Group had just done a report on managing Palestine's looming succession or leadership transition, and we had mapped out 3 different scenarios, given the fact that we have absolutely no legitimate institutional avenues to pursue elections, because Abu Mazen has managed to get rid of a legislature, which means that constitutional provisions in case he were to pass from the scene tomorrow are not in place. So how would the process then happen? And a lot of Palestinian political elites at the time, and this was, when I say at the time, I mean very recently, were very much in favor of, instead of elections, instead appointing the next president through a process of either the PLO Executive Committee, which is a small group of people selecting the next leadership, or Abu Mazen himself appointing someone. or, allowing things to descend into chaos, which unfortunately, at the time when I was asking political elites whether that was a potential scenario that could materialize, I kid you not when I say this, and it was quite scary to see it, a lot of them actually took that as a serious option at the time, right? And especially security elites. And then they then started to refer to themselves subconsciously as a potential forerunner, and speaking of a potential opportunity, if it presented itself, to emulate the Egyptian experience with some kind of military coup. So they've really shown no inclination to even think about elections. And worse yet, elections were actually the worst case scenario for a lot of these elites, because they know that they will not be able to withstand a popular vote. In terms of what we can expect after Abu Mazen, I think, again, Palestinians are not very hopeful in terms of any positive change in the status quo. And that's because if you look at the forerunners, especially people that they feel the international community and Israel are propping to the forefront, people like Hussein al-Sheikh, for example, they really are not people who are looking to rock the boat in any way. So it really will be a continuation of the kind of status quo we're seeing now. We certainly won't be seeing any kind of receding process of authoritarianism. We won't see really any kind of process of advocating for a political horizon. None of that. I mean, Hussein al-Sheikh's position is very much clear. He's very much a man who's willing to accept concessions in exchange for certain compromises on the Palestinian side, which is what he's shown over the last year or so since we've seen him being pushed to the diplomatic forefront. So Palestinians aren't really expecting things to change in any substantial positive way.
Thank you. The next question comes from Mariana. Yep. So she asks you to tell us more about the current state of affairs in terms of overall demands. Is the two states proposal still holding, or what's on the horizon? Sorry.
I mean, we do see the PA still pushing the two-state narrative, the two-state discourse, and it would be premature to rule it out. So unfortunately, with the two-state solution, it's been very much tied to the failed process of Oslo. But that doesn't mean that a two-state necessarily is completely, intangible. It's just about how that process is allowed to, take effect. And Oslo has been absolutely disastrous. But that, again, should not mean that the two-state solution in and of itself is not plausible. It's just about looking for an alternative route. But ultimately, one state, two state, Palestinians are not in any way united on their vision for a future. If anything, I think at this point in time, Palestinians don't really have one. They have no idea whether they still want a two state, whether a one state would be the best solution. Israel could very easily oppress them in a one state arrangement as they could in a two state. And they do recognize that. There's also the worry for many who object to the idea of a one state about what happens to their national rights. Does that mean that they become Israeli citizens? What about their identity as Palestinians? So there's a lot to unpack there. Now, the problem is not necessarily the end. It's lacking not only the strategy to get there, but more importantly, the discussions in order to decide that objective. So right now, Palestinians do not have the discursive or even physical space to even have these conversations. A couple of weeks ago, we saw an alliance bloc trying to hold a press conference in order to hold a workshop to start thinking about institutional arrangements beyond what has been an ineffective PLO, a stagnant, redundant body for such a long time. And before that could even get off the ground, the PA had raided their offices, their headquarters, arrested their members, and shut down the press conference. They are quite literally not being given any space to even have these discussions. So it's not really up for any of us to decide that for them. That is really a conversation Palestinians need to have, but they need to have the institutional avenues to have that, like a revived Palestinian National Council. Right. But they're not being given that opportunity.
It's very interesting. I'd like to make a comment in order to lead the comment to the next question. You mentioned about this unhappiness, let's use this word, of the Palestinians towards the Palestinian Authority. and what it could represent. Me, myself, it's my third year teaching the guitar in the conservatory at Kamanjati. So like we are kind of close all the time to this public funds and this and that. And the other day we've learned that this very important institution, it just ran away the name, I'm sorry, Khalili Sakakini, passed through a process that the PA was claiming, or let's say this, the building or something to build, anyways. So it's complicated to see even this kind of public policies coming from the PA. It actually looks more like a barrier imposed by the PA in these terms. And in this sense, it's interesting because also this represented the political parties that represents people. They seemed to appear more, correct me if I'm wrong, when you have manifestations, for example, with the martyrs, or when they die and they come to Manara and they do these demonstrations with the flags of the parties and this and that. So then they appear in this kind of spaces, or also in the universities, for example, the elections in the Birzeit University and this and that. And this leads to the question that I would like to do to from Gustavo Matos. Do the Palestinians, especially the youth, still have figures like Yasser Arafat, Leila Khaled, Kanafani, or other people like that emerging from these groups, or how do you see that? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it, Yani. It's just like this emergency of new figures within this political parties, and also confronting the policies imposed by the PA in this sense. Like, do you feel that this emergency is happening, or how do you see that?
I think unfortunately today there are no unifying figures for a lot of Palestinians, and that seems to be precisely the problem when we talk about a leadership vacuum. Is that on the one hand they're so disconnected from their current leaders, but on the other hand, again, they have no alternative. And that was something that we saw during the elections build-up. You know, even the left, they weren't able to even unify around one single candidate that could lead their list. So they broke up into about 30 different lists, you know, and that is still a systematic problem today with Palestinian civil society, is that they do not have a single leadership as an alternative. Even though we do, like I said, have these factions, they exist in all but name. A lot of their interests have been compromised. A lot of them are run by individuals, personalities. A lot of it is based still on personal self-interest. But in terms of being able to represent or advocate for any kind of political agenda, their capacity is non-existent, effectively. They are very similar to the rest of Palestinian civil society in the sense that as much as they may oppose the existing leadership, they are not able to offer a viable way out.
Right. Yeah, I think this is already answered, because there was another question here about socialist or popular movements in favor of a strong unity among Palestinians against the Israeli occupation. I think it's already there. Let me see what I have here. This is another question. How do movements like Hamas and Fatah impact the Palestinian political scenario nowadays in terms of civil society, let's say this?
I mean, they've been incredibly detrimental to civil society, I think. Hamas in Gaza are behaving no differently to Fatah in the West Bank. Each are trying to protect their respective power base. Each are trying to protect their respective hegemony. Again, the limitations on freedom, the suffocating atmosphere that civil society has to operate under, coupled with the fact that they, in Gaza, unfortunately, are also under an international, blockade and limitations to really the work that they can do, their capacity, their capabilities, and then also having to confront an incredibly authoritarian de facto government in the form of Hamas. And the same with Fatah. And a lot of that has to do, again, with their rivalry. I mean, even today, when you speak to the Palestinian Authority about this phenomenon of armed resistance, even though groups like the Lion's Den, the Jenin Brigades, are very explicit that they're not looking to take over the PA, they are not looking to fight the PA, you'll still hear the PA speak of them in such derogatory terms, where they try and instill fear amongst the local community to limit the support that these groups can get, because they feel it's a threat to their hegemony on the ground. At some point, these groups may be able to challenge them. At some point, these groups may be infiltrated by Hamas. Hamas is the constant boogeyman that the PA deploy when they need relevance, when they need to, try and deflect from their own weaknesses and shortcomings. And that's exactly what you're hearing now. So honestly, Fatah and Hamas have truly not only hijacked the political scene, but been so detrimental in terms of destroying any prospect for any unified national movement.
Right. Yeah, I think your answer brings us to the next question. And I'd like to make a comment before too. I remember some years ago when I used to also teach for Kamanjati and going to Jenin. So we cross on the way to Nablus before Jenin, and we cross Hawara. And Hawara nowadays is on the spot because of the things that are taking place there. And the presence of the military is absurd along with the settlers. I'm so sorry. So also the last Saturday we had shooting taking place at the area, and it was like precisely 20 minutes after we crossed. And this brings to the next question. So it's by Julio Cesar. Like, what is the potential for political change presented by the new Palestinian group Alliance then? And the rest of the question is, what's the space and limits for non-violent resistance in places like Mustafa and Hawara?
So I think the capacity for political change from groups like the Lion's Den is, again, very limited. Limited in the sense of their capacity, limited in sense of even what this group is trying to achieve, right? So beyond resistance, like physically resisting the occupation, they have no strategy, they have no organization, they have no political agenda. That's pretty abundant in the fact, or pretty evident in the fact that these groups, for example, are not necessarily looking for strong tactical victories. A lot of it is about making an ethical statement, putting their lives and bodies, at the front line in order to fight an incredibly violent occupation, but that's about it. But that isn't enough to really inspire or bring on political change if we're talking about, rebellion or transformation of the existing social and political arrangements. Sorry, could you repeat the second question about this?
No, it's what's the space and limits for non-violent resistance in places like this?
I mean, look, there's still space, there's still potential. I mean, the broad majority of Palestinians are still very much inclined toward non-violent resistance and protest and seeking those routes in order to attain their rights. But the problem ultimately is the lack. There is no unifying discourse. It's the lack of ability in order to really turn it into some serious cross alliance-based civil movement. And that's where Palestinian civil society has really failed, is that, yes, you can see clusters of demonstrations here and there, but they often tend to implode. Movements that have propped up over the last couple of years, they haven't lasted very long. And it's because they're not able to keep that momentum going. They're not able to bridge the divides at the moment, whether it's social, class-based, geographic, political. And that's really been, the biggest hindrance, I think, for Palestinian opposition.
Right. Thank you. So we have a group of 3 or 4 questions that are related to international, to the international scenario, let's say. I think this is absolutely interesting, considering what we were talking before, like this representation about Palestine abroad and complexity of the ground. And this leads us to considering this complexity, this diverse scenario, this controversy many times scenario here in Palestine. The first question is, I'm going to do 2 at once. How could the Brazilian government get closer to Palestine in this sense, also considering the new elections of Lula? And the second one, just to bring it together, since Europe and the USA have not gotten anywhere with their positions, would it be possible to envision China as a future widely support for the self-determination of Palestine?
So, I mean, this is actually something that Crisis Group are now trying to work on, which is looking at other avenues that can help elevate the Palestinian position internationally. That means looking at other countries beyond Western states. And, you know, that can, again, that's something that can involve multiple trajectories, you know, the fact that you can generate that kind of popular support that is enough to implement the kind of tangible policy changes at a political level, where your governments can start pushing for Palestinians to be able, or to make certain international avenues much easier for them to advocate. Right. So whether it's using the International Criminal Court as a means to try and pressure Israel and advocate for their own rights, where in the past, you know, Western states have tried to use that as a carrot and stick with the Palestinians, where every time they've tried to leverage their ability to use international institutions in order to advocate for themselves, they've been immediately shut down with threats of, you know, funding being pulled, or you know, having sanctions imposed, or a change in leadership, or whatever. And I think that's really where other states, other non-European Western states, can really come in and try and help Palestinians leverage their ability to be able to use these institutions to their advantage. You know, and I think, again, that goes back into the second question, which is Europe and the US. I mean, unfortunately, as much as we have complete donor fatigue from both of these you know, areas, from both Europe and the US, at the same time, for a lack of better policy, they're continuing to prop up the status quo. Now, can we expect states like China to fill that void? I mean, China hasn't really expressed any inclination to do so, so it's hard to determine. But, you know, again, the question would be, where would these states want to then leverage the current political or the current status quo? You know, would it be towards a positive trajectory for Palestinians? And I think that's also something we have to be mindful for.
We have a question made by the Professor Arlene. Could an international conference of Palestinians from both inside and the diaspora come together to discuss and possibly begin to create an alternative political solution and narrative for Palestine?
I mean, it's certainly a great idea in theory, but I think the question would then be, who would those representatives be, right? Who would those representatives ultimately be? If we're talking about the diaspora, who in the diaspora? You know, there are certain voices that are more prominent that claim to speak on behalf of the diaspora than others. And that may not necessarily be actually fully representative of those in the diaspora, right? And the same thing for those within the occupied territories. Which voices are we giving these platforms to? You know, often it tends to be Western educated or the intelligentsia class that tend to shout the loudest and get offered these platforms, which ends up being very, very counterproductive, because they speak an entirely different language. They speak from an entirely different perspective and understanding to Palestinians who are living an entirely different reality wherever they're spread. So I think we have to be mindful as to, you know, that's not a great, you know, sorry, that's not a bad idea, but I mean, at least in theory, but if we're talking about practice, we need to make sure that it's as representative as possible.
Absolutely. And also, as we see in Latin America, the strong presence of institutions, federations, ruled and driven by Palestinian institutions that not necessarily speak the same language. This is very clear, and it makes it difficult. Let's see. We have another one. Bruno, would popular demonstrations around the world be more effective in changing public opinion so that Israel is pressured to accept more advantageous deals for the Palestinians?
I mean, if those demonstrations, it's great to see that solidarity, but ultimately what is needed is for that solidarity to translate itself into something politically tangible. And if that public support is enough to put pressure on their political leaders to start instituting some of those changes, then yes. But at the moment, as much as we've seen Palestinian global solidarity rise, especially in the last couple of years, and especially in places that seem so incredibly unlikely, like the US, for example, it hasn't still been enough to actually create any significant positive, tangible change for Palestinians. And I think that is the main concern here. It's not necessarily about, of course it is about the show of solidarity, but ultimately it can only amount to so much if it's able to actually create tangible changes on the ground.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It brings to another question. This is a personal question. Frequently, I hear that many significant movements should or would appear from the Palestinians organized from inside, from 48. And so that they could kind of organize a kind of a significant changing in terms of the contextual local reality, let's say. But these Palestinians from 48, even though they are constantly in the West Bank and vice versa, but it doesn't seem that there is this intent of organizing themselves as Palestinians, even though they claim that they are in Palestine and they are Palestinians, as we all know. But it doesn't seem to be appearing this kind of organization. So when it comes to this discussion, it frequently comes to the discussion of Palestinians only from the West Bank. So I would like to hear from you a little comment on this difference between political organizations in the West Bank and 48 Palestine.
Absolutely. I think that's, again, very symbolic of the differences and the fragmentation of Palestinian society itself, right? So those living in 48, those living in the West Bank, those living in Gaza, even those living in the diaspora, and it depends where in the diaspora. If you're talking about Arab states that haven't been able to assimilate these populations compared to those that thrive well in Western states, where they're given, at the bare minimum, basic services, interests, objectives, how you understand your national movement, how you understand the objective of political organizing, the language you deploy is so significantly different. And again, if we're going to narrow it down to 48ers or West Bank Palestinians, it's the same thing, and not all 48ers have any interest in wanting to, come under the authority of a Palestinian national authority. Why would you, right? Unfortunately, for all the disadvantages they have to live under, they're still in a somewhat better position than a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, that absolutely do not have even the freedom to leave the West Bank. You have a lot of Palestinians that have never actually left the West Bank ever. Can you imagine how suffocating that must be? So it really is a testament to just how completely divided Palestinians are, and the real obstacles ahead of them when we're talking about political organizing, and more importantly, in terms of trying to come at one unified objective, because our interests have completely splintered at this point.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can maybe do two more questions. So Lorenza is asking you, can you talk about women resistance groups in Palestine, thinking in an international relation context. Is there anything in Palestine that resembles the YPJ in Syria, for example?
I mean, resistance groups now today, unfortunately, do not. And that was again that was by design, right? So there was a concerted effort from both Israel and the international community in order to get rid of those armed groups that could operate to the degree that they used to, which was, very much transnationally. We used to have the Palestinian Liberation Army. The factions had, their own armed groups that were spread across different parts of the region. You have Islamic Jihad that kind of operates transnationally, but again, it's still very limited. And if you're talking about its capacity within Gaza and the kind of the way that it's been delegitimized and clamped down upon in order for Hamas to secure its hegemony in Gaza, and then compare that to also the treatment it gets in the West Bank from Israel, from the PA. So there have been concerted efforts from both the Israelis and also the Palestinian Authority in order to make sure that these armed groups have very, very limited capacity. Which means that, even in a place like the West Bank, it's a miracle that we even have the kinds of groups we do that arose over the last year, because the West Bank is so severely cut off from not only neighboring states around it, but also from Gaza, from 48. I mean, it's literally an island with little mini islands within it. And these groups, again, still, suffer from issues of coordination because of how geographically cut off they are from each other. So as much as groups like the Jenin Brigades and Lions Den and Balata Camp can maybe coordinate, you don't have that same level of coordination with other cities. And you're just talking about within the vicinity of the West Bank, let alone transnationally, where the obstacles are significantly even more harder. So at the moment, no, unfortunately, and a lot of that has been by design.
Yeah. Julius Caesar is asking you, he asks two questions actually. If you could speak about the persecution that members of the Palestinian National Council suffer, because a lot of them are now in Israeli jails. And also he's asking how laws and regulations are constructed and approved within the PA nowadays.
Sorry, could you repeat the last question? How laws and
regulations are approved within the PA nowadays?
So, I mean, the Palestinian National Council hasn't really been in effect for a very long time. I think they held a session last year, which was boycotted by a large majority of factions, and that was only because at the time, it was very much a rigged process of electing certain members to the PLO Executive Committee, and that was in order to strengthen those particular members' positions when it came to the battle for succession. But the majority of PNC members were completely marginalized from that process. Even people within the PLO Executive Committee were marginalized from that process. Prominent individuals that weren't even made aware of that, that certain individuals had already been appointed. So the PNC has been very much a defunct body for a very, very long time. The persecution they suffer or have suffered, yes, some of their members are in Israeli jails, but the PNC still has quite a significant number of members to them. But it's just it's not necessarily the persecution that makes it defunct. It's the fact that unfortunately you have an incredibly authoritarian authority that has sidelined all institutions. Palestinian politics doesn't operate through institutions any longer. It operates through one or three individuals at most. Which takes us to your second question about how laws and regulations are created. And again, a lot of it is done through presidential decrees. They do not have a functioning legislature. So, and they've been, ruled by presidential decree for the last 15 years. So that is how laws are made. And in that time, we've had over 400 presidential decrees in the last 15 years. Can you imagine how much of a mess their legal system is? So it's unfortunate, but that is how laws are created and regulations, decided upon. It's very much the decision of three individuals.
Right. We had a question before, I cannot find it here, but it was about Barghouti and its potential possibility of becoming the new leadership, let's say this, but this brings us to this question about who is behind the BDS movement, and if you could talk about the BDS movement in terms of your point of view, but also like local and international effects.
So sorry, the first question about Barghouti.
No, it's just because it leads like this second question is who is behind the BDS movement.
Right. Okay. Right.
So
okay.
and this leads us to what's your view on this movement, and locally and internationally, of course.
I mean, I can't really speak to BDS because I'm not very much involved in the activism side of things. So I'm much more, state policy inclined, but not so much the activist element. So.
That's all right. So in this sense, in your point of view, could you attempt to suggest a way out to the current political impasse in Palestine? How do you see this in terms of academics, productions, in terms of political organizations? I don't know. How do you see this? This is a question of Professor Arlene.
I mean, I think the way out currently for in terms of getting us out of this current political impasse that we're at is reviving institutions. I think that it's not necessarily about the institutions themselves, but what that process can then represent, right? Which is a broader mechanism for legitimate change. So it's about reviving a legislative body. It's about reviving a Palestinian National Council, for example. Providing a change of leadership from bottom up. And then from there, you can start to think about things like how service provision should be provided for, what a new political horizon can be, what are broader Palestinian national goals. But without those institutions, there are very few, if any, means for Palestinians to gather and to start having these discussions. Importantly, at the moment, given how severe living standards have deteriorated at the moment, most Palestinians can't really focus on broader political questions when your priority is quite literally living hand to mouth every day, right? Worrying about where your next meal is going to come from or how you're going to provide for your family. So it really is about tackling first the most immediate issues, which is service provision, giving Palestinians, access to adequate health, education, jobs, and then being able to provide them with the legitimate institutional avenues to start having the broader political questions that they need. But to do that, they need representatives to do that. Nowhere in the world is it possible for everyone to get together and have these conversations. They need representatives. They need legitimate advocates, but people they recognize. And that's where it's really important for the international community to facilitate, not preempt that process as they have done in the past.
I think maybe we have only one more question. The occupation, this is from João Pedro, the occupation leads to the death of many adults and elderly people. This leaves the political organization in the hands of the young people, as already said. So it reflects the political fragmentation of Palestinians. I think this one was already answered, if I'm not wrong. I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, this one is already made. So they are asking me just to clarify that when we called PA, we are talking about the Palestinian Authority.
Yes.
I think we've made all the questions that we had. And so I might call back Professor Arlene. But before that, I would like to thank you very much, Tahani. And it was very inspiring. And really, to me, as all the others lectures that we had, this was another one absolutely incredible, bringing us to the ground in Palestine and to new subjects that regularly we don't have access to. So your speech is absolutely important. and we are absolutely pleasured with your presence. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Tahani, I think Rafael has said it all in terms of how grateful we are for your explanations, your views on this problem of political succession in Palestine today. So yeah, if we don't have any other final words, I don't know if you'd like to leave a final word before we close the session.
I mean, as I mentioned just previously, it's really important that, whatever it is, if they're, like I said, Palestinians are completely, divided on many things, but one thing that they are united on at the moment is the need for a change in leadership. And the one strategy they can all seem to agree on is the need for elections. They want elections. It's not about the process of elections per se, it's what those elections can ultimately represent for them, which is a desperate need for a renewal in order to get them out the impasse that they're at. And more importantly, they need an international community that is willing to put the conditionalities and the pressure on a leadership that is so far really hindering that desperate need for change. And more importantly, to facilitate that process that Palestinians want and to respect whatever the outcome of that process is, which unfortunately we have seen in the past has not always been the case.
Right, so thank you very much, Tahani, and thank you very much, Rafael, for mediating this session. So it's great to have you. Thank you for everyone who's been watching and taking this course. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.